Hello and welcome to the 21st Century Work-Life podcast, where we talk about leading remote teams, online collaboration, and working in distributed organizations. This podcast is brought to you by Virtual Not Distant, where we help managers and teams transition to an office-optional approach. Find out everything we do over at virtualnotdistant.com and check out our show notes and pictures of our lovely guests over on the podcast page. It's great to have you here, listeners. Let's get on with the show. Hello and welcome to episode 284 of the 21st Century Work-Life podcast, which is a What's Going On episode, but with a special angle. We're going to have more non-newsy content than usual, and we'll explain why in a second. But when I say we, well, my name is Pilar Orti, and with me is Maya Middlemiss. Hello, Maya.
Hello, Pilar. Hello, everyone.
Good. So the reason why this is a less newsy episode is that I don't know, Maya, but I think that what's coming out at the moment is just more of the same all the time. What do you think?
It's becoming more difficult to pick out anything interesting and new that's being said about hybrid or the return to work and blah.
So we didn't want to do a blah episode. Instead, we will do one which at some points might have a slightly angry and frustrating tone, so please excuse that. And and just if you hear it and it annoys you, then just skip like 3 minutes, and we'll be back to not non-frustrated and angry tone. But two things that did come out this month, and actually we're recording on the 22nd of September, and this doesn't come out till beginning of October, so there's quite a lag. So if you found any interesting articles over that period, please send them through. You can contact us via virtualnotdistant.com, or you can email me directly, pilar@virtualnotdistant.com. So if you find anything that you think actually you might enjoy this and other listeners might enjoy this. But two pieces that have come out are two pieces of research. And one was published in Nature, and it was all about how remote work had impacted networks within Microsoft in the US. And then there's another piece on psychological safety in virtual teams, where actually the research was done before the pandemic. So a real virtual team, not people working from home during the pandemic, as in the Microsoft article. And what these articles have in common, and which I think is something that is going on in people's minds at the moment, Maya, is that there's something around the boundaries that get created, either deliberately or not deliberately, around us as individuals or around us as teams when we are remote. So I thought we could touch on different kind of boundaries, or as you call it in your book, Maya, edges, which is a very much nicer, I think it's a nicer word. And maybe we can look at some of that. So we give this episode a content focus, but including some of the stuff that is going on.
Yep, sounds like it is an ongoing thing. It's very much a work in progress. I think organizations, teams and individuals are struggling to work this one out. So it will always be topical because it won't ever be sorted.
Yeah, exactly. But before that, I thought we'd flip it and do some listener news and some community news first, because we had quite a lot of conversation around the episode on asynchronous facilitation. And I say conversation around because some of the conversation that's interesting was around a blog post, a post I shared on LinkedIn even before we released the episode. And this was about asynchronous communication. So I'm going to sound a bit because I'm in my tablet in Trello and all this was ready. Okay, this is going to be a problem. The episode with Simon was on introducing asynchronous communication from a facilitator point of view, but there's a lot there when we're looking at leadership in a remote team. And one of the call outs on LinkedIn that I did was, how can we help or encourage others to create a healthier balance between synchronous and asynchronous interactions in a team and even in an organization? So we'll stick the link to that, but I wanted to thank Morgan, Tammy, Katerina, and you, Maya, and Jody, who's following, for the contribution. So if you're on LinkedIn, have a look there. And if not, I'm going to write some kind of blog post or something to summarize this.
I think a blog post would be a really good idea. This is such an emerging practice that I think just giving people some ideas and some phrases and some tools to protect that asynchronous time is really important.
Because as we discussed in the episode with Simon, it's a lot of it is around mindset and the weight that we give asynchronous communication, which is not very much. And this is the key. We continue to say this in order for remote work to continue working, even in a hybrid environment, is to really embrace asynchronous communication as something that is just as useful and important as meetings, or else it's never going to work.
Yeah, I think we've been caught up in this. This is thoughts I'm just having now and didn't plan in advance, so I'll try and get them out not too muddledly. I think we're caught in a tension between the way a lot of the pandemic remote work has led to hyper monitoring and micromanagement, and a feeling that people have to be present at all times and account for what they're doing at all times to their manager or to their team. And now we're saying to people, you've got to protect your deep work time, you've got to collaborate asynchronously, and you've got to respect other people's need to do that as well. And I think some people are probably caught in the tension between the two of, how do I show up and be visible and make them see how productive and present I am, where at the same time I'm trying to get my head down and actually do the work. So somehow we need better tools or practices around that.
And also it might have become a habit, because especially at the beginning of the pandemic, everyone had a need, well, most people, I'm generalizing, had a need for connection. And the way in which we best connect, like, okay, you might need to call me out on this, but how we connect more deeply and faster and really find like we are being wrapped around, that we're wrapping people around us, is through real time.
Yes.
And also because people have been doing this in offices for ages, and if you haven't worked apart from each other, of course you've been doing asynchronous communication, but not that everything was left. Everything that felt important was left for real time because people were accessible. So I also wonder whether there's some habit that was formed from the beginning of the pandemic that meetings are the thing where we connect, where we really talk, where we really embrace our humanity and all these things. And we now need to go back and change that habit. Some people
it's kind of growing up emotionally a little bit.
Well, I wouldn't say growing up. I would say changing what we're used to, because it's I don't. Yeah, so I think it's about change and changing habits and how we connect with people. And we've never had to think. Many people have never had to think before about how they build their relationships at work. It's just happened, and now we've got to do it deliberately. So there's a whole thing, but for those people who have only experienced remote work during the pandemic, it's really important to remember that you need that balance, or else, like Maya says, people are never comfortable, can't really take ownership of their own time if we're just relying on meetings for everything. So yes.
Looking forward to the blog post.
Yes, I'm looking forward to it too. The other post that got a little bit of comments, and it's worth looking at the blog post on our website, is the reposting of the Office as another collaboration tool, which I wrote on LinkedIn back in April 2020, but now it's just people are in a different space. And this talks about a lot. I mean, it just summarizes Matt Mullenweg's levels of remote work. So most credit is to him about the content, but it was an interesting one. So do check that post.
It's an important one to revisit right now, I think. Well, a lot of people are trying to work out what their office is for.
Yes,
what it's going to be for in the short term and in the long term. So I think it's also an important reminder that the office has value. It's just to see it, you might need to step outside this idea of going back to what we had.
I think that's really important to remember, and that is at the core of what we say is the office has value. We've never said it doesn't, and we've never said it doesn't have a place, but you need to revisit that. Great. So there's a comment that we'll come to later around that because it's relevant. Okay, let me just, I have to say all these windows in my Samsung tablet are driving me a bit crazy. Okay, so there's two pieces of research that are very relevant to what we're talking about today. And one of them is an article on psychological safety. It's how to create psychological safety in virtual teams. And I wonder whether this has been properly published yet, but you can find a version of it online, and Maya will link to it in the show notes. And I heard about this in a podcast called People Soup, and they had the lady who'd done the research explain it. Oh God, sorry.
People Soup is a wonderful name.
It is. It really is. So I'm sorry, I can't bring up the whole thing because Samsung Notes has decided that my note was corrupt. Have you got it in front of you, just for the title and the name?
I have got the PDF in front of me. How to create psychological safety in virtual teams, and the authors are Alexandra Lechner and I think it's Hutta Tobias Mortlock.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, great.
And it was published. It's available in Science Direct, and it was published by Elsevier. I'll put the link in the show notes so anyone wants to have a read of the full thing.
Yeah, excellent. And it's I enjoyed listening to her, and I enjoyed reading it because it was all the recommendations as well were very broad. I mean, the sample size was small; it was only 16 people. I think we have to say that, but it was pre-pandemic, and it really shows when you read it. It shows an understanding and a maturity in the space.
Yes, it does. It's interesting that the fieldwork was pre-pandemic, but obviously a lot of the reflection has taken place later on. So that's a valuable perspective, I think, to show what you need and what happens when virtual teams are put under different pressures.
Yeah,
how people can adjust to that. But I thought it was quite. I think what I took from this was a kind of optimism that people can improve, and you can fix things in virtual teams if you learn better practices and create more psychological safety and raise the emotional intelligence. All of this is fixable. So you just need to pay a bit of attention to it deliberately.
I think you're right. It says, look, it is hard and these things happen. However, there are ways, and something that she said in the interview that is not in the article. She said a lot of these things, and specifically she was talking about, we'll come back to this in a second, how we tend to form bubbles even in our teams. Like there's always one or two people that we always reach out to. That also happens in the co-located teams, but of course there's different ways in which that gets solved. So I like that she was saying a lot of this happens in every team. It's not specific. However, in a remote space, it either takes longer to get fixed or to address. It's just and the whole thing was about how you need to be more deliberate.
Yes, and it's all I quite like the kind of practicalness of this. A lot of this is about if you change the behavior, the feeling will follow.
Yes.
If you just do these things, then it will raise your emotional intelligence and the way you connect and so on. So quite practical tactics that people could just have a go at trying to connect with other people in the ways that they're suggesting.
Yeah, it's a great piece and very much needed. The other article we're going to be touching on and refer to is called The Effects of Remote Work on Collaboration Among Information Workers. And it was published on the 9th of September 2021 in Nature, Human Behavior. And I came across this article first through Luis Suarez on LinkedIn, where he ripped it apart. And then Bernie Mitchell also tagged me and said, "Oh, Pilar, you must read this." And I thought, I can't be bothered. I'm not reading it. And Luis had a bit of a go at me saying, "You don't do that. Don't disengage." And then lovely listener Igor sent me a copy by email. He said, "Oh, have you seen this? It's probably interesting." He hadn't read it yet when he sent it. And that's when I thought, okay, got to read it. I hadn't realized it was in Nature. Nature is a very highly respected journal in the life sciences. And then when I saw the whole thing, I was just like, oh, I was gutted. So I'm going to read the abstract, and then maybe we can come to little bits as we go along the episode, because this could be one of those episodes where we just spend the time ripping it apart, and it's not fair because the authors are not here with us. But the article is, the sample size is huge compared to the other paper.
True,
it's it is a big sample. It's more than 61,000 Microsoft employees in the US. But this is during the pandemic. During the first 6 months of 2020. So, and that is really not, it says the effects of remote work on collaboration. It doesn't say anything about the pandemic.
It's completely overlooked. It's like this huge elephant in the whole paper. That, oh, by the way, the whole world was in crisis during the time of this fieldwork, and that may have impacted on some of this stuff. It's just not mentioned at all.
Yeah. And if I read the abstract, so it says the coronavirus pandemic caused a rapid shift to full-time remote work for many information workers. And this is another thing, what I'm going to say next, that a lot of people have picked up in the space. Viewing the shift as a natural experiment in which some workers were already working remotely before the pandemic enables us to separate the effects of firm-wide remote work from other pandemic-related confounding factors. The problem is that we didn't see how those work. You don't have it. It can't be an experiment because you need the same context for both.
Like that whole sentence seems to encapsulate what's wrong with this from a controlled experiment point of view, that they're missing the point that there wasn't a separate control study done when there wasn't a pandemic.
Yeah. What it does very well then, it's comparing remote work during a pandemic with remote work before.
Yeah,
really. That's what
you're not comparing a whole organization working remotely versus a team. You're comparing, there's too many variables.
Yeah. And so what also worries me is, the kind of rich data that they use was emails, calendars, instant messages, video, audio calls, and the number of work week hours. Yeah, anyway, they didn't use Microsoft Teams, they didn't use Yammer, even LinkedIn, which the use of people, not freelancers, on LinkedIn to network has been huge.
Yes.
And the reason why that comes to mind is because it says our results show that firm-wide remote work caused the collaboration network of workers to become more static and siloed, with fewer bridges between disparate parts. If you don't put LinkedIn in there, you're missing out on, I imagine, a huge amount of data.
Yeah. And, even the things that people used for collaboration during the pandemic, like WhatsApp and so on, which you wouldn't normally consider part of your perfectly designed collaboration business tool set. But there were so many ways people connected and supported each other outside of Microsoft.
Yeah. And then furthermore, there was a decrease in synchronous communication and an increase in asynchronous communication. Together, these effects may make it harder for employees to acquire and share new information across the network. And that's when we all go, okay.
How do you get from that first sentence to the next one? There is no causality there at all. And nothing that I read, and honestly, it was heavy going, all this research data, but I still didn't see anything that actually demonstrated a causal effect between an increase in async and a lack of ability to acquire and share new information.
Yeah. So anyway, that's why we wanted to, this is what's been going on. The important thing about this is that this is not the only article that has some kind of research about what happened during the pandemic and labels it under remote work and then makes recommendations on the back of that. So listeners, I'm sure that, a lot of you, those who've been listening to the show for ages are probably like, yeah, what's new next? But if you are looking for data and articles and stuff out there to guide you through the next steps in your organization or your team, or even as an individual, just make sure that you that you know the context in which the research has been read.
And if you look through some of this, you could, if you think that this is reflecting issues that you recognize within your own teams or organizations, maybe it can help you to think about why.
Yes.
Things like the idea of the number, there's a remark about the ties bridging different groups within an organization. And so, well, why has that happened? There will always be a solution to it. And it's not because you're working remotely, it's because of something about how you're using the tools that you've got to collaborate. So it's useful for kind of highlighting, even though I think that a lot of their premises are weird and misguided, that there's a lot of information in here that people can use if they want to put things right within their own organizations.
Exactly. And to that point, we'll come to that a little bit more under the boundaries as well. But the article on psychological safety mentions the bubbles and the difficulty in creating those networks. It says you've got to work hard at it. And I think that's what the Microsoft article is missing. It's the fact that this is happening, but actually in the remote space, you can do things.
Yes, this is the problem here. Here's a list of problems. There's no solutions because it's as though they consider all these problems as structural.
Yes. Yeah, that's the problem. Okay, so we've got different kind of boundaries that we can control when we are working apart from each other, and we thought we'd touch on some of these. And the first one, I think, is that especially if we're advocating for more asynchronous collaboration, which, in contrary to what the article says, for us can strengthen some of those ties and actually can help for networks to build, because LinkedIn, Twitter, I'm going to say Facebook, these are all social networks that thrive on asynchronous communication, and all these networks have been built through those. So, but the problem is that it's never ending. So the problem is how do we look at that? How do we deal with that problem, Maya? How do we create some edges around the work so that it stops at some point?
Yeah, it's really difficult. I think we have to start by recognizing that we need to. I think that's what's got lost in this somewhere with it, whether that's by teams or by managers or by individuals. There needs to be a bit of somehow, when we do this reset that we're all talking about, pausing and thinking about what we want going forward, we need to just recognize that we need those boundaries and that it's okay to talk about them and give people back ownership of the beginning and end of their day and their working time. And I think it's starting to happen. People are, the phrase asynchronous collaboration is starting to appear now in mainstream media commentary and discussions and so on, even outside of the business press, whereas that was a really niche remote thing that only people who worked on weird international teams had to think about a couple of years ago. So it's getting there. There's a long way to go. And I think, again, it's this backlash from people who felt that they had to account for every minute of their time and how they were spending it, and staying visible to a manager who could no longer look them in the eye and felt insecure about that. Now they need to be able to say to that manager, yeah, I am here, I'm working, but I can't take a call till this afternoon because I'm working on something I need to get my head down into, and find ways of sharing that commitment. We just need better tools, I think. And I don't know, new stuff is emerging all the time, but it's going to have to come from individuals a little bit. I got somebody's out of office there. No, it wasn't even out of office. It was just an email signature saying, and I can't remember the exact wording, but I thought it was really good. It was something like, I won't assume your working hours are my working hours, and I'll get back to you in a reasonable time. But it might not be what you think is reasonable. And she phrased it much better than that. But I thought, I like that. That's the kind of thing we need more of. We shouldn't have to say that, but actually at the moment we do. And eventually, hopefully, we won't, because everyone will just understand that, and they won't be sitting there thinking, why hasn't she replied to my email that I sent 5 minutes ago?
Yeah, I think you're right. The first is that recognition and starting to talk about it, and also the hangover behaviors from the pandemic, like also with managers themselves thinking they need to be available all the time.
Yes.
That is so exhausting also. And it's okay to say, I'm not available at these times. And everyone knows that if there's an emergency, they're going to contact you. But I think part of being available is also being very clear about when you're not available. I wanted to say hello to him at the beginning of the episode, but I think it's pertinent to this. I had a phone call from one of our listeners this morning.
A phone call?
From Bart, yes, long time listener and also friend, talking about building networks asynchronously, although we've had lots of chat, but anyway. And he called our phone number, which goes through Skype, and he said, I wasn't sure whether to call, but I thought, well, if it's not a good time, she won't pick up. And of course, we haven't agreed that, but he knows me and he can say that. But is this thing of knowing the other person or having agreed something in the team so that then we have the freedom to decide. Yes. And we're not like, oh, well, I'm not going to call just in case. Well, actually, I know I can call her because if it's not the right time, she's not going to answer.
And it is coming back to that conversation about conversations then, and having a protocol in place that the phone won't be answered unless somebody's free, or yes, you can WhatsApp the head of engineering if the building's on fire or something, but the rest of the time they have office hours on Slack between 2 and 4 in the afternoon in their time zone or something. And if once you know all that, you can operate really confidently. And I'm just trying to remember the last time I just phoned somebody.
Yeah.
Yeah, even personal friends or family, you normally just WhatsApp first. Are you around for a quick chat? And you wouldn't just spontaneously phone. So I'm really glad that Bart did that, and that's still a thing.
Yes. And it's interesting because in the paper on psychological safety, they're talking about how even spontaneous calling sorry, let me start again. Because they hadn't defined their boundaries, somebody was saying something they didn't like was somebody just doing a video call in the middle of the day without any warning to someone. Mm. And they said they decided that before doing that, they would send a message to say, are you free to talk? Mm. But we can't assume that that's going to make everyone comfortable, because before the pandemic, I don't know if you remember, I think you were at this workshop, we were talking about this and we were saying, you can always send a message before, or no, we were talking about availability in visible teamwork and just having a way of signaling when you're available for these spontaneous conversations. And somebody said, I really don't like that, because since when do we have to do that? Since when do we have to ask first someone whether, I want to be able to pick up the phone and call. And so it's interesting that, one, that might have changed because of context, but also we just need to have that conversation and say why.
Yeah, and we have always had to do that, actually. People have always had private work time where they can't be interrupted, where they've put a do not disturb on their office door or whatever, whether people use that as consciously as they now do electronically sometimes. It's never been unreasonable to say, I'm not just sitting here waiting to talk to you.
Yes.
Or I'm doing work which really demands 100% of my attention, and therefore I don't want to be interrupted. And I think it gets mixed up as well with people's personal communication styles. I have one freelance client, it's actually a client of theirs who's sponsored content I manage. And every time I send them an email, he replies and says, have you got a moment to have a quick chat about this? Mm-hmm. And he wants to change one line in a document or something. And it's incredibly disruptive, because I know he won't move on the work. And I have to just reply and say, no, I'm in meetings all afternoon, because I know there's a part of me that really wants to say, no, I'm actually writing and I'm not working on your stuff now, so go away. Or just tell me what you want me to do and I'll fix it. Yeah. By the time we've had the 2 emails about the call I don't want to have, we could have sorted it. And some people just cannot seem to get that asynchronous thing into their head, and it just doesn't suit their style, and it's quite hard to guide people in that direction when you have to work together.
That is so important to realize that. And it reminds me of a tweet from Martin Gilbraith, who was listening to the episode with Simon Wilson on asynchronous facilitation. And he just tweeted yesterday, he picked up on the mindset thing that some people, and whether this is preference, habit, it doesn't matter where it's coming from, will have all the time in the world for a meeting, but they will not put the time away for what we call asynchronous collaboration, which is usually replying to messages and moving the work forward.
Yes.
But he was also saying, which I found funny, I found really spot on, was that, look, we always work asynchronously because we go and do our own stuff in different time to other people. But there is this mindset that it's okay to back to your conversation with your client, it's okay to say, I can't do that then because I'm in a meeting. It's more difficult to be able to say, I can't do that because I'm working on my deep work. And that's where we need to get to. We need to get to know that time is blocked for, I've only got this other time, rather than have to say, I'm in a meeting with myself.
Yeah, or maybe we won't have to account for it at all one day. We'll get to the point where we're not covering up a doctor's appointment or something like that, and we'll just say, no, I'm not available. And this particular client of a client he'd looked at my schedule, which he had, where he could book a meeting, and none of that worked for him. So he was messaging me to say, could we just have a quick call anyway?
Right.
Outside of the time that I've made available for calls, because it's the time I don't tend to do that asynchronous deep collaboration or creation work. And in fact, I think he's from Texas, and he actually used the word, can we have a quick sync about the article?
You can sync async, can't you?
Yeah. We can have a quick async if you just tell me what you want to change.
Yeah. So I think from a self-awareness point of view, it's really important to realize when we might be doing this onto other people without realizing. I think that's what I'm taking from that.
Yes, your urgent is not my urgent necessarily.
Yeah. And there are the two ways of communicating, and one is for non-urgent and one is for urgent or complex. We need to understand the difference between those two. One other point on this, which Colin commented on the Office Optional article referring to asynchronous communication, and it's about dealing with different projects and how sometimes either as freelancers or as people who work in more than one team or project in an organization, moving communication to async can feel like an overwhelm. And he was actually talking about task switching throughout the day to be able to keep up. And I think that this is also something that needs to, a conversation that needs to happen also in project teams. It's when are we going to be working on our project? Well, I'm going to do Monday morning or whatever and Tuesday morning. So don't expect the work to advance between this day and this day.
Yeah, and don't worry if you don't see anything happening in the document or whatever, because you shouldn't. You don't have to even concern yourself about that. It's in my court and I'll deal with it when I said I would.
And in fact, I'm beginning to think that it becomes even more important for cross-functional teams, for project teams, for volunteer teams as well that are dipping in and out, part-time teams. It becomes even more important to have this conversation so that there's less friction, and also so that we can understand the rhythm of the team. I think in a full-time team, it gets a little bit easier, but I think that when we're apart from each other, not just in space, but also in time and in headspace, it needs even more of an agreement.
Yeah, and it needs some sort of respectful consideration from the individual as well. And I was talking about this to somebody recently about working as a freelancer can be the ultimate in async, in the sense that some people I collaborate with all the time, like you, Pilar, and we're constantly connected and sharing information. But I have other people who might literally pop up once every 6 or 12 months and say, can I have this? And that's fine, because I know that they're giving me all that they've got and I love working with them. But the fact is they also expect me to remember that they use AP style and their invoicing cycle is this, and they prefer to receive comments in this way and so on. And if I didn't keep quite detailed notes about each client, it's like for them, for me, it's much more asynchronous because I'm an occasional collaborator, and for them, they're immersed in that practice all the time. So it doesn't occur to them to say, oh, and by the way, remember we use Canadian English.
Yes.
Yes. You what? Okay. Yeah. And obviously I wouldn't be a good contractor if I didn't keep a note of everything that they needed last time and check in with them to say, are you still using Canadian English, or are you doing it the way the rest of the internet now does it? But that's fine. I have to work really, really asynchronously. And the only way I can do that actually is by having that conversation offline and asynchronously, because if I jump on a call with them, I haven't got that information in my head. And I need to be able to come back to it and immerse myself a little bit. There's a certain amount of in writing particularly, but I'm sure in other creative tasks as well, and things like programming, you have to kind of just have a little bit of time to re-immerse yourself in that mindset to get started anyway. You can't just necessarily jump in and be synchronous.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. Yeah. Good. So we're starting to go into defining communication boundaries, which are not just around time, but also about, like, you're talking, well, I mean, huge range there. And I found what I found great was in the article on psychological safety, that one of the things they said helps to build that psychological safety in a team is discussing the rules of the game, which I've been saying for ages, which is just agreeing on how we're going to work. Even, and I had this pre-pandemic as well. Okay, can we agree how we want to use Slack? Oh, we just use it. Oh, it's fine. And it's like, okay. And
No,
I've been
it's not.
guilty
It's
of
a total
going,
mess.
yeah. And then later you can realize that, yeah, they've used it in a community, so they don't check it every day, blah, blah. Anyway. But very interesting that from ground rules, what the authors of the paper, they talk about behavioral norms. Again, things that we might not be used to discussing because it just happens, to personal boundaries and even meeting routines. I think that is really important as well, especially if we've just been having these meetings whenever, because that's how we work. But actually, we might now need to discuss that a little bit more. And all of this is about making team members' responses more predictable and seeing there's a bit more predictability, and then therefore we feel safer.
Yes, and let's remember that all of this stuff also applies in the co-located space as well, and it was somebody's first day in a new job. They probably picked up an awful lot just by observation and osmosis and looking around them. It didn't necessarily mean that somebody sat down and said, oh, by the way, we always arrive for meetings 10 minutes early and talk about the weather.
Yeah.
Or whatever, or you bring your sandwiches if it's a lunch meeting. And people didn't necessarily formalize that stuff any better in the shared office space. It's just like everything in remote, you have to be a little bit more deliberate about it.
Yeah. And amazing point about the new people as well, especially if we're moving to a hybrid environment. Hybrid is, I'm sorry, but hybrid is a subset of remote. This is going to be like
saying it.
The new thing. I keep saying maybe, office optional didn't stick, but the concept arrived thanks to COVID. It is a subset of remote. Therefore, if we are going to be away from each other and in the office with each other, we need to talk about how that is going to work.
Yeah.
And just being more specific, again, like you were saying, the paper is highly practical. It's about aligning the use of the tools with the team's needs, not aligning the use of the tools with how they want us to work. This one, it goes back also to the connection. Agree on shared goals and responsibilities. And this includes knowing who to ask for help. And I suppose this is more pertinent to new people and new teams. But again, we're not going to be in an environment where we have so much informal communication that we can pick up who's best to ask what. So we might need to make that explicit.
Yeah, and it's not just new people, because it can be very occasional things like my working with a client once a year or whatever. You could have that same situation in a team where there's a big annual thing that if you just write down some procedures and document things as you go along, you don't have to end up with the GitLab handbook of 2,000 pages or something, but just to have somewhere people can go and look that's a source of truth. Oh yes, when we do the annual report, we talk to this person and we do that, and we do, oh yeah, it's all there. And nobody's left thinking, oh, I don't know what I'm supposed to be doing or who I'm supposed to ask, and am I being a pain by asking the wrong person or asking the right person too often or whatever.
And that's a really important aspect of asynchronous communication that is harder for new people to adopt, which is this whole concept of documentation. It's not about
level 5 stuff.
Yes, it is. It is. And it really is about some of the processes and stuff that you are saying. Like, it's not about, okay, what are the steps, but also the little informal things like the best person to help us in the organization about this at the moment is this person. Remembering if that person leaves to go back and update that documentation. It can feel a little bit like some people think it takes the humanity out of it and the spontaneity, but actually it's just a way of making better use of the space.
Yeah.
And again,
and that's a cop-out, I think. I hate it when people say that about the spontaneity. What it does is it frees you to have that spontaneity and human connection, because you've nailed down all the stuff that doesn't change and doesn't depend on that. Then you can relate and connect around it because the important stuff is written down somewhere.
Yeah, such an important point. And I would, to this thing they said in the paper of agreeing on shared goals and responsibilities, I would add and make them visible. Because it's all very well to usually discuss them in a in a meeting, but always being visible. It really, again, the thing is, and especially as we're making transitions, our heads are really full of stuff.
Yeah.
So what can we put in writing online in a drawing so that we don't have to remember it?
Yeah, and there are really good tools for this again as well. You know, organizations and teams have so much data that they generate, stuff that's being measured all the time that they don't even know about. You have to think about what you want to make visible where. And you can probably get somebody off Upwork just to make you a dashboard of progress towards your goals, or, you know, times contributed to client X, or whatever is important to you to track. You should be able to do that automatically and just have it somewhere that anybody who needs or might want to see it can do that really easily, again, without having to say, can you give me a status report on project whatever?
Yeah.
You should be able to just go and have a look. Project whatever is streaming along and it's 70% complete and it's ahead of schedule or whatever. And, you know, all of that data exists within your system and it's already digitized. We just need somebody to pull it together in a visualization that's meaningful for those who need to see it.
And I'm going to talk tools, seeing as you mentioned the tech, because someone in virtual team talks mentioned how Planner, and they mentioned Planner. And Planner is something within the Microsoft environment that you can access through Microsoft Teams, which is like Trello. So this is like the most simple way of keeping track of what everyone is doing. But many people in organizations don't know they've got that. And talking to some managers during the pandemic, especially, they were like, oh, that would be really useful, because that is the bit that consumes their meetings. That is the bit that makes them feel like they're micromanaging, when all they want to know is what people are doing, but they can't lift their head and see or go past the screen or just ask. It feels like a bigger deal to pick up the phone or send an email to ask if something has been done than it would if you just shouted across a desk. And this is the issue we're trying to look at, is what are the barriers to making this work? And this is one of them, is the fact that asking where you're at with the work can feel, even in the best relationships, it can feel like you're nagging. I do that with working with Simon.
It's like you're trying to catch people out or hold people accountable in ways that they feel they've got to be a little bit defensive about. Whereas if you just get the visible workflow right as part of your visible teamwork setup, nobody should have to have those conversations. What the manager can then do is get the overview and see where there are bottlenecks or problems, and then they could go and have that one-to-one conversation where they can actually make a difference and be helpful or unstick something or support somebody. Instead of the people who are doing fine don't need anybody saying, so how's that going then?
Yeah, and you can do it at any time of the day.
Yeah.
Which is, again, going back to just having control of your life. Of course, sometimes it's an excuse to start a conversation when you call it, how are you getting on with that? How are you doing? And then you're checking in rather than checking up.
Which is
but that's a separate
fine.
thing.
And that checking in should be part of the culture anyway. You shouldn't necessarily need it in, though, of course, you know, just in normal human conversation, sometimes we do.
Yeah. So, so communication boundaries, and something else that that was interesting from the psychological safety, some of the examples they had in that paper, was that somebody actually really liked having a meeting I don't know if it was every day or every week at the same time, because in having all this flexibility and in everyone having slightly different schedules and feeling apart from each other, that meeting gave them a fixed point in time in which to anchor themselves. So I think that sometimes, talking about difference between synchronous and asynchronous is really interesting for me, that meeting was not about alignment or connection. It was just about anchoring the day for that person.
Yeah, that's interesting because it probably had a different use ostensibly in the schedule. It was probably a status meeting or something like that, which we've just been saying you could do that completely asynchronously. You don't need to have a meeting to say how your work's going. But actually that synchronous connection could provide a very different purpose. And it might be different for different members of the team as well.
Yeah. Did you just bang the microphone?
Sorry, did I just bang them? I was gesticulating. Sorry, Ross. Maybe you could take that.
No, don't take it out, because and this is what synchronous can give us as well.
Yeah.
Like real time. It's immediately. I can't see you, so listeners, Maya and I record without video, and that gave me a real hint of movement at your end. So no, it's great. It's great.
Sometimes you can hear me banging my head on the desk as well.
You can't get that through Trello, but we've got emojis, so we're getting there. Great. Okay, so we've got communication boundaries, and now I think if we look at where we have to be careful that we are not creating boundaries when we don't want them, where we are sharpening the edges of our time and relationships when we don't want it. And this does go back to the Microsoft article, but I wanted to start with something that is mentioned in the psychological safety article, which is where she was talking about how when we're working remotely, we tend to, in a team, create more of a bubble with some other team members. So the example being, and the authors say, well, I heard the authors say, like I said before, that this also happens in co-located, but it's more noticeable in remote. And it's the fact that, especially when we join a new team, we have one or two people that we feel more comfortable to talk with. And she mentions it could be due to the shared location. So this is important for hybrid, but also it could be language if you're in an international team. It could be seniority. I would say also age or prior experience. So there's loads of factors. This is not just about remote, why we might be gravitating towards a person. And what tends to happen is we will always reach out to 1, 2, 3 people. And of course, there is the team aspect that you might unnecessarily be creating a boundary between a group of people and leaving people out. But also, of course, it can stop you from gathering information. And what the authors are saying is in the office, this can spontaneously be broken because just you have spontaneous interactions with other people and suddenly you've expanded your bubble. In the online space, we've got to notice that. We've got to notice that.
Yeah, it's a tricky one because this is human nature, isn't it? It always has been. We look for ways to connect and develop closeness with people. And if you just say it's your day one on a team with 10 people, you can't develop your personal relationships with 9 other people equally and kind of smoothly. You're going to connect first with the person who smiles at you or seems to go for lunch at the same time as you, or it looks from their accessories that they're into the same kind of music and culture that you are, or whatever. So these kind of tribes emerge very, very quickly in every social setting. People look for points of connection. And I think maybe the problem is online is that we present so little of ourselves, and often perhaps we curate it very heavily anyway, that it's harder to make those connections in the first place. And they're likely to be very narrow slices of the whole human. So maybe we form kind of faster, deeper connections with smaller numbers of people because they're the only ones who've joined the cat photos channel in our Slack. And that's all we know about them. They've got cats too. And so we all share pictures of working at home with our cats or whatever. And then we form a bubble around that. But actually, you might have far more in common with the way that you think or feel politically, or the kind of out of work activities that you do but you don't talk about, or something with somebody else in your team, and you just don't necessarily bump into that information in the same way remotely. But I think we'll never get away from it because this is what human beings do. We relate to each other and we form groups, and we do it really quickly. My 16-year-old's been back at school for 2 weeks. She already knows exactly who the cool kids group is, the emo kids, the sporty kids, and they've all just this whole year group has just fragmented off immediately because that's what people do.
So it's human nature. So we've got to accept that it's going to happen in whatever space. And I think we then need to, if we want to change that, we need to do something deliberately. And this comes back to, it could be an organizational responsibility, because this goes back to the article on Microsoft, who was saying that the networks had either stopped growing or had the teams had gone silos. Well, if you're not reaching out, if you're not looking out to see who else you might connect with in your team or your organization, if you're not deliberately thinking, God, I've already asked Maya 5 questions this week, let me ask Simon because I haven't heard from him for a while because I don't work with him that often. If you're not doing that deliberately, then it's not going to happen. It's just not going to happen by chance. And also, I always refer back when I'm talking about this to Chris Coladonato, who is in the January 2021 episode, I think, or maybe yeah. And she very deliberately has maintained her network, has built her network in her organization by going into Yammer every day, looking at the different groups. She's a member of different groups. Yammer is like a in-house LinkedIn, I'm going to say, instead of Facebook. And she will continue to nurture the relationships with those people she already knows, but every now and then she will deliberately comment and connect with someone who she doesn't know. So,
and I remember that conversation. She was so structured about it.
Yeah.
It's like, this is part of my work. It's part of my work is to build these relationships, and this is how I do it. I join in this many of this type of conversations, and then I look for this, and wow. Okay, and she's active on LinkedIn and things outside of the organization.
Outside as well. So this is a real understanding of the online space. This is, everyone says, oh, it's not great because it silos you, blah, blah. No, the online space allows you to grow your network. It might be a bit more difficult. And depending on your personality, going back to, you might prefer to be having a coffee with someone rather than commenting on their LinkedIn post. So this is also that, but I think we just need to be aware of that. And something that really annoyed me, my husband said this morning, don't read that, it's going to make you angry. But of the Microsoft article is at the end, they're talking about things to look out for and, when you get the hybrid space and stuff. And they really seem to be posing the solution to the networking aspect as in using the office more and using it deliberately for that. When if you want cross-functional collaboration, if you want people to be able to reach out to people in the different parts of the organization, the online space is better.
Yes, they're not going to be in the same office as you. They might not even be in the same building or the same country as you. You can network with them online far more easily than you ever could face-to-face in that case.
And I worked with a client quite early on in the pandemic. And it also depends on where you are in the organization and your job. Of course, everything we're saying always depends, but it's a counter-argument. And I worked with a management team, and one of them said, I've never talked to so many people in different parts of the organization as during the last 2 months. Of course, pandemic in context, they probably had to because of the crisis thing. But they were saying, normally I just see the person and I talk to them twice in a year because it's when we meet in a whatever retreat or whatever. Now we've had a few conversations, blah, blah, blah. So I think that when we're going hybrid, don't keep the online space going. It's got to
go. Absolutely. Well, the thing is, you're not going to roll the clock back on that as much as lots of people would like to roll the clock back to 2019 on so many fronts. That woman that you spoke to, she's built those relationships now. So wherever she's working and wherever those other people are working, they're going to have a way to stay connected and stay in touch, even if they're back to the office and surrounded by the same half a dozen people in each of their floors or their buildings. Then they've already used the online space to make that connection, and that's not going to suddenly not have happened. I really hope that there'll be some lasting outcome of this, even for the kind of enterprises that are saying, right, we want everybody back at their desks.
Yeah. And finally, I think the other boundaries are the personal boundaries, I think. And when in the article on psychological safety, it talks about connecting as humans and how that helps with psychological safety. And you've already mentioned, Maya, as well, that there's lots of points of connection we might have as people that we might not have as colleagues or task people who are doing tasks. And I just like a reminder that it's not always about, I've got a note here, it's not always about cats and children that we connect over. So even if you are a private person, because I have had this before, even if you're a private person, you can open up yourself in different ways. So being human is also saying why you love what you're doing or why you hate what you're doing. It's also sharing stuff about what you like about the work, about the industry. It's just going beyond the transactional task-related things. So I think that we can really carefully, and this is, I suppose, when you've used social media, you're probably more aware of this, is that you can craft your boundaries around that as well. You can be completely like open up and show everyone your personal life. And if that makes you happy and that helps you connect and do your work better, you can do that. Or you cannot have anyone know what your home looks like because you've got a backdrop or you use the Zoom thing, but actually be very open and candid about why you take the decisions you take.
Yes, and this is really important, going back to the categorization we've talked about in the past about integrators and separators. You can make a very deliberate choice that you want to separate your personal and work life completely, but that doesn't mean you can't develop deep relationships. You just have to be conscious of that. And maybe you feel pressured by other people sharing pictures of their cats and their kids and their troubles or whatever, but you shouldn't be that. You should feel that you can respond in your own way, and bring some of yourself, your preferences, your thought processes, your values into conversations which can be just about the work, if that's the area that you feel comfortable connecting and sharing about. So I think that's a really important point that you're making there, Pilar, that it doesn't necessarily mean you have to start sharing your private life or your family or or even your innermost sort of values or anything else, but you can still have strong opinions about quite narrow work-related things that you have in common with that person anyway.
So I think also for this, I mean, it goes for everyone, but also for managers and people with either explicit influence or non-explicit influence. I think there's a lot of role modeling around this as well, that it's okay. It's okay to be the full person and to share your full life with people, but it's also okay to pull back. And I think especially there's so much. It's so interesting, Maya, because there's just so much for me hangover from the pandemic that we just need to go, okay, that was that context. And again, do we want to keep stuff? Do we want to blah, blah, blah? And because one of the things that has been celebrated during the pandemic has been the fact that people have felt safer, actually, to bring more of themselves in whatever shape or form to their teams and the other people, that we want to understand that will have had different degrees for everyone.
Yes, and let's keep the good bits. Let's keep what matters, but let's keep trying to deepen connections however we can. And I'm remembering now something that you wrote years ago, and maybe it wasn't that many years, but it's pre-pandemic, so it feels like another era. But it was about conflict on remote teams and about how important it is to practice having differences and exploring those differences, and actually, that it's therefore actually important to the way that your team deals with resolving big work-related stuff. The fact that you've already expressed your opinion about what you thought of the first round of Bake Off, as something really low stakes and non-work related. If you're used to thinking, well, I can see how that person thinks or how they argue, what's important to them, what excites them or whatever, that actually makes it much easier when you have to disagree or stand your ground over something that's really important. The fact that you already know that person a little bit more and you're comfortable with having a difference of opinion with them and expressing that constructively.
Nice one. Nice reminder. So listeners, I don't know about you, Maya. I thought this was going to be a short episode, and look at the size of it. So we kept the two articles. We only looked at two articles, but then we looked at defining our boundaries around time, our communication boundaries, about just making sure we're not creating boundaries when we don't mean to, and also all things about our personal life. Before we head off, Maya, anything you want to say to our listeners?
No, I think just like you, I thought, yes, this would be a nice, quick, tight one because we know exactly what we think about all of this. And that's the trouble is we've always got so much to say. But I think it was a really interesting discussion. So I hope some of you are still listening.
If you are still listening, please get in touch, virtualnotdistant.com. We have a contact form. If you subscribe to our newsletter, you can download our free guide to leading through visible teamwork, which is all about nudging you to putting some of this stuff into an asynchronous communication process. You can follow us on LinkedIn. On Twitter, we are Virtual Teamwork with a 0 instead of an O. And my email, if you want to connect in an asynchronous old-fashioned way, is pilar@virtualnotdistant.com. Thank you very much for listening. A big thank you for listening to the 21st Century Work-Life podcast produced by Virtual Not Distant. If you have something to add to the conversation, let us know through the contact form over at virtualnotdistant.com. I have been your host, Pilar Orti, and I'm signing off now. Wherever you are, whatever you're doing, enjoy.